In some cases, philosophy takes the form of activism. And that's the case with the next philosopher I'd like to speak with you about. And her name is Mary Wollenstoncraft. She's an 18th century British author, and she was born in 1759. She died in 1797. Her life was quite tumultuous and yet very productive. She was self-taught. She was an autodidact, as they say. And one of her chief concerns was education, was the philosophy of education. And in fact, her first published work was called Thoughts on the Education of Daughters. She also wrote a book in 1788, which was her autobiography, simply called Mary. And she wrote a commentary on Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution of France, a vindication of the rights of men. And that was published in 1790, and then she revised it in 1791. But the work that she's mostly famous for is called A Vindication of the Rights of Women, and it was published in 1792. So there's another very impressive item about her life. She died from complications giving birth to her daughter, but that daughter became Mary Shelley. Her last name became Shelley because she married the famous poet Percy Shelley, and she wrote the most famous novel probably in British literature. It's called Frankenstein. The subtitle was A Modern Prometheus, which was interesting just for its own right, but an allegory about the autonomy of science and the coming technology. So that's an interesting item about her life. But let's concentrate on Mary herself. So I'd like to think about how Mary Wollstonecraft's work relates to the question of human nature. So we can ask this question: in what sense are the writings of Mary Wollstonecraft related to the philosophy of human nature, or to that discipline that has come to be called philosophical anthropology? Well, insofar as her works provide a critique of the social forces that inhibit the development of human beings, and I'm talking about both men and women, and because she goes on to offer a path leading to overcoming these inhibiting forces, her work then paves the way to overcoming what John Stuart Mill called one of the chief hindrances of human improvement. So her work is focused on unmasking these invisible forces that are inhibiting the future development of the human species. Now, the work provides some difficulty to the modern reader because it uses the language of 18th century England. And so I had to look up a lot of words and even ask my wife, who knows this period a lot better than I do, about some of the words and some of the meaning of the text. But although her works were relevant during the time she was writing, they continue to be relevant because of the very reasons why philosophy, no matter when it comes, it continues to be relevant. The very invisible forces, which in my mind has to do with values. And values are these invisible forces that shape human beings. And people who are living unphilosophically and lack the powers of good judgment and critical thinking, the multitudes, as Plato expressed so forcefully in his wonderful allegory of the cave, the multitudes of people simply appropriate these opinions and these values uncritically, and they become shaped by them. And so they become who they are, not by their own will and their own choice, but simply by appropriating the opinions and feelings and what came to be called the archi, the first principles that happened to be dominant during a particular time. So Mary Wollstonecraft's works were like the first really philosophical writings that provide a basis for the feminist movement. But that really didn't take on until the 60s in the United States. But it became a real force, the feminist movement. But it had a long history behind it, the whole 100 years of protest in the United States of for women's suffrage, and the writings of Simone de Beauvoir, who wrote The Second Sex, much back in the early 20th century. So it has a history, but Mary Wollstonecraft was the first. And it's not only an activism, but it's philosophical. And I began to tell you that although it was more relevant during her time, it continues to be relevant because those same forces haven't gone away. Although they've been addressed by some, they still haven't gone away. So her works are still quite relevant. My first reading of the passage, which are the first 18 paragraphs from chapter 6 of her most famous work called A Vindication of the Rights of Women, I had to definitely go back and look up words in the dictionary. And in fact, there's some key words that if you don't look them up, and there's no reason why anyone living in the 20th century would have these words as part of their vocabulary, unless you're well-read during the period of this time. So you have to look up some words, and you have to read it more than once. I mean, I'm a seasoned philosopher. I had to read it more than once. But I think what I'd like to do with you is take you paragraph by paragraph and show you, just point out the key idea, and I'll paraphrase it for you from each paragraph. There are 18 paragraphs. And they sort of form a movement. Up to paragraph 5, it forms like the beginning. And then from 5 to another, I forget exactly what paragraph it is, it forms another section. And then there's a final section that includes the final paragraphs. So let's take a close look at the first 18 paragraphs from chapter 6 of her A Vindication of the Rights of Women. First thing to do is look at the title of this chapter. It's called The Effects Which an Early Association of Ideas Has Upon Character. Well, after having read these 18 paragraphs several times, I've come to the conclusion that if I were to place her works into some school of thought, I would say that she would be a British empiricist, because she makes a big deal about the association of ideas and empirical experience. So I'm sure she read the writings of David Hume, John Locke, and the British empiricists, but she still is very much an Enlightenment thinker. I mean, she's living right during the dawn of the Enlightenment, and she says quite clearly that the most salient characteristic of a human being is reason. So any inhibition of reason would be the inhibition of the human species. So what are these forces that she is able to unmask, these invisible forces, these values, as I call them, that have been shaping both women and men and inhibiting the future evolution of the human species? That's the way I'd like to approach this. Let's see if we can extract the philosophical anthropology from these 18 paragraphs. Well, the first paragraph is quite telling. You're going to have to look up a word, which I had to look up. The first paragraph of chapter 6 reads as follows: Education in an enervating style. So I didn't know the word enervating. It's not part of my, it just means weakening, a weakening style. So let's say that again. Education in a weakening style. And then there's an ellipsis, so there's something being omitted there. And not having a chance from their subordinate state in society to uncover their lost ground. Is it surprising that women everywhere appear a defect in nature? So here she's addressing the very question of human nature. And she's saying, okay, for the most part, women have assumed an inferior position. But that's a rhetorical question. She's really not asking a question. You probably know that. She's making a statement. She goes, it's not by accident then that since women's education is inferior to men, is it surprising that they're considered a defect in nature, in human nature? Is it surprising when we consider what a determinate effect an early association of ideas has on the character, that they neglect their understandings? The understanding is this ability to make good judgments, critical thinking, and developing not just the arts, like, for example, learning languages or playing music, but I'm talking about judgment, making judgments and thinking critically and evaluating arguments and so on. That's the kind of education that she thinks is lacking among women. That the women themselves then begin to neglect their understandings, the rational aspect of human nature, and they turn all their attentions to their person. Now, when she says person, she doesn't mean their development of their moral character. There's a difference between personality and character. The word personality comes from the ancient Roman and Greek idea that when on the stage, someone wears a mask. And so the mask was called the persona. But that's not who the person is, that's the mask they wear. So personality is something more superficial than one's character. So what Mary's saying here is that they focus their attentions now on their personality, on their being charming, on their being attractive to whom? To men. So that's the gist of paragraph 1. Now, paragraph 2 tells me that she's read the history of British empiricism. I don't know. I'm not a scholar of Mary Wollenstoncraft, so this is all new to me too. I do have her book, the big book, The Vindication of the Rights of Women, and I've read some of it, but I'm not a Mary Wollenstoncraft scholar or anything. So, but when I read paragraph 2 of chapter 6, that told me that she knows empiricism. Now, what she's talking about there in the second paragraph is how powerful the association of ideas are, especially early childhood experiences. There are associations we have when we're very young, and those associations cling to one another, so that when you get older, as soon as you are exposed to some object, it evokes those trace memories from your past. And she doesn't talk of the unconscious because Freud hasn't come along yet to make that a focal point of discussion. There was hardly any mention of the unconscious unless it was indirect. But what she's talking about is how these early associations, especially of women, young girls, they form very solid connections between ideas and feelings. And then as they grow older, rather than losing these connections, they're still there. And so when they experience any objects, any stimuli from the world, instead of responding to the stimuli, they're responding to the trace memories that cling to those stimuli. So that's a philosophical explanation. But she wants to really make this solid, how early childhood memories form these solid associations. And she's setting, she's developing that in the second paragraph because she wants to show in the next paragraphs to come how the education of women and the forces that are shaping what it means to be a woman are unable to loosen these associations, so they remain infantile. Okay, so that's the second paragraph is just showing how actually there's more to that too. Actually, she's also showing how even among genius, how these associations are playing a part to give rise to genius. But in the case of genius, it's the ingenuity and the critical faculties that are controlling the associations rather than the associations controlling judgment. So that's really a packed paragraph. It's very philosophical, and the reason I'm going paragraph by paragraph with you on this, because the writing is distant from us in time, and it's easy for the reader just to throw up their hands and say, this is, you know, so unclear, I'll never understand it, and then just give up. So if you're patient with it, and if you look up a few words, it's really not that bad. The third paragraph, so let's move. Yeah, the third paragraph is where she starts speaking about genius. It's just a transitional paragraph. It's really not that important. I must be allowed to explain myself. You know, she understands that what she just said may not be all that clear. The generality of people cannot see or feel poetically. They want fancy, and therefore fly from solitude in search of sensible objects. But when an author leads them, his eyes, they can see as he saw. Lends them his eyes, they can see as he saw and be amused by the images they could not select, though lying before them. She's just saying that most people, they flee from their solitude into sensible objects, and they concern themselves with these objects. But then there's the genius who creates things, and these people then can look through the eyes of the genius and see as he or she saw. The third paragraph then gives a rationale of why she's talking about genius. Education thus only supplies the man of genius with knowledge to give variety and contrast to his associations. But there is a habitual association of ideas that grows with our growth. Now she's starting to get to her point. Let's read on in paragraph 4. There is a habitual association of ideas. Remember, I told you that was a key idea in her second paragraph. And it grows with our growth. It's based on experience. And we start associating certain feelings with certain words, with certain objects. And it has a great effect on the moral character of mankind, and by which a turn is given to the mind that commonly remains throughout life. So easily led, the word is ductile, which means easily led. So ductile is the understanding, and yet so stubborn that the associations which depend on adventitious circumstance, adventitious means circumstances that happen to take place in close association with one another, in time or in place, during the period that the body takes to arrive at maturity, can seldom be disentangled from reason. One idea calls upon another. Again, let's not get caught up in all the details. It's just that there's this association that's very solid in our unconscious, and one idea that is associated with another, and objects then become associated with experiences. Have you ever like walked down a particular, I remember sometimes when I go back home to my hometown and I'll reminisce, take a little drive around my hometown and drive down the streets that I used to walk and ride my bike in when I was a kid. There's a certain feeling that associates with those streets. Why? Because we had experiences in those streets that cling to one another. So now we see the street and we have the same feeling that is clinging to that street because the street is associated with certain experiences, okay? These are the laws of association. The British empiricists made a big deal about this. And behaviorism and classical conditioning, is all based on these ideas. All right, so one idea calls upon another, its old associate, okay? And memory, faithful to first impressions, particularly when the intellectual powers are not employed to cool our sensations. She put that in parentheses because that's going to be the condition of women. It retraces them with mechanical exactness. So she's just talking about the process of conditioning. And she's going to move now into how women become the way they are for the most part, and how men become the way they are for the most part. But these forces that are shaping us, these inhibiting associations that have taken place from our early childhood, some of them are shed by men, she's going to say in the coming paragraphs. But women, because of the social forces that have been established, they're not shed and they remain infantile. So let's move on to see. So this habitual slavery, these habits, she's really talking about a kind of unconscious habits of association. This habitual slavery to first impressions has a more baneful effect on female than on men's character. Now, for the first time in these 18 paragraphs, she's making this gender distinction. By the way, as a passing thought, Mary Wollenstoncraft could be labeled like the mother of the feminist movement because she was the first, and she was the first to think it philosophically. There were times and places like in Sparta in ancient Greece where women like ran the government, and not in Athens, but in Sparta. And, but there's no really philosophy of feminism. And Mary was the first. So that just jumped into my head. Thought I'd share that with you. Let's call Mary Wollstonecraft the mother of the feminist movement. All right, so these first impressions she's saying in the 5th paragraph that shape us to become who we are. And it's a kind of slavery too, because there's nothing to break up the associations. They have a more baneful, a more negative effect on females than on men. Why? Because business and other employments of the understanding tend to deaden the feelings and break associations that do violence to reason. So that's important expression. So just because it's become part of the customs of Western civilization that professions belong to men, and doing business and those kinds of things, they deaden and they break these associations that do violence to reason. That's a key thing, because reason is the key idea here, right? Because the whole enlightenment means the light of reason. So what it means to be human means to be rational. So any inhibition of reason would be the inhibition of the human species. Because going all the way back to Aristotle, human beings are rational animals. So that's what defines our species. It's what makes us different from all the other animals. So she's saying, because of the very customs that have been part of Western civilization, that men do business and those other dry what does she call them? Other dry employments of the understanding that they tend to break these associations in men. But females who are made women of when they are mere children, now she's going back to the very way young females are being treated as opposed to the way young boys are treated, are brought back to childhood when they ought to have left the go-kart forever. The word go-kart probably means a baby buggy, like little girls push a baby buggy pretending they're mothers. In other words, they should have left their infantile natures long time ago, but they remain infantile. And not sufficient strength of mind to efface the super inductions of art that have smothered nature, human nature. By art, she means the forces that are shaping human nature. She doesn't mean art like in the paintings and things like that. Although paintings are formed by artists, they're forms of art. She's using the word art in the wider sense. Okay, so that's the gist of now from this paragraph on, from the 5th paragraph, she's going to talk about the systematic inhibition of the development of reason and the violence to reason that takes place in women and in men. So paragraph 6 is all about the formation of docile bodies through these associations. Let's take a look. Let me read out loud paragraph 6, and then I'll try to paragraph for you. Everything that they see, they refers to women, and here serves to fix impressions, call forth emotions, and associate ideas. See, now it justifies why she went into that long discussion of the laws of association in the 2nd paragraph, that give a sexual character to the mind. False notions of beauty and delicacy stop the growth of their limbs and produce a sickly soreness rather than delicacy of organs, and thus weaken by being employed in unfolding instead of examining the first associations forced on them by every surrounding object, how they can attain the vigor necessary to enable them to throw off their fictitious character, where find strength to recur to reason and rise superior to a system of oppression that blasts the fair promise of spring. That's another rhetorical question. The cruel association of ideas, which everything conspires to twist into their habits of thinking, or to speak more precisely, of feeling. She's going to also point out that to be a woman then is to diminish the powers of reason and just to become a feeling person. It receives new force when they begin to act a little for themselves. For they then perceive that it is only through their address to excite emotions in men that pleasure and power are to be obtained. So now what's happening is, because of these unconscious, invisible values that are dominating society, women then appropriate the ideal of what it means to be a woman from men. And so they focus on how they can develop themselves to excite men. And they find the women find their power and their pleasure in being attractive to men. Besides all the books professionally written for their instruction, which make first impressions on their minds, probably all the books of etiquette and manners and so on, all inculcate the same opinions. Let's move on to paragraph 7. Their highest praise is to obey the will of man, Rote learning is not the same as education, and why they prefer rake. I put those in my notes as the key ideas in paragraph 7. Paragraph 7 is all about, for instance, the severest sarcasms have been leveled against the sex, and they have been ridiculed for repeating a set of phrases learned by rote, when nothing could be more natural, considering the education they receive, and that their highest praise is to obey, unargued, the will of men. What she's saying there is that it's been said about women that their education is just to repeat by rote. But that's the education that they got. That's why I put in my notes, there's a big difference between learning and developing the understanding, which involves learning judgment and critical thinking, and learning by rote, memorizing things. Like even memorizing a piece of music, which is fine and a wonderful thing to do, but you're playing somebody else's music, or reciting poetry, or learning a language, being able to play the piano, not improvise and not compose music, but to play music. And this involved the education of the aristocratic women of the time. So she's saying there in paragraph 7, these sarcastic remarks that women are ridiculed for a set of phrases learned by rote, but this is natural considering their education, because their education is based on their highest praise is to obey unargued the will of man. And if they are not allowed to have reason sufficient to govern their own conduct, see, there's another thing I would underscore. What defines the human for Mary Wollenstoncraft is to have reason sufficient enough to guide their own conduct. See, that she's talking about taking possession of your life and being self-ruling. What's the word? Self-determining, taking possession of yourself and developing yourself in whatever direction you choose. Instead of doing that, what they're doing is learning by rote and receiving the education that men allow. Now, the next paragraph, 8, and the word comes up a few times again. The word is rake, and it has, I didn't know the word actually. I had to ask my wife, and I looked it up, and when I looked it up, it just said a rake, like raking your leaves. But there's another meaning of the word rake, and basically a rake is a debauched man, like a womanizer, a dissolute and debauched man. During the times when she was writing, there were men who were called gentlemen, but they were like womanizers. They were gentlemen. They knew all the manners. They were charming. They knew how to woo a woman, and they were called rakes. And now she's going to go develop this idea that rakes, these debauched, they're not debauched like con men or, these were gentlemen, and they were charming and dashing, and they would know how to patronize and flirt with and be charming for women. And so she writes, rakes know how to work on their sensibility. A rake is the counterpart to the docile beauty that society has shaped women into. So now you have these two sides of human nature. On the one, I mean, there are men who are not rakes also. Let's put them off to the side. But now we got these two poles, these two, one on the one side is the rake, and the other side is the docile beauty, the attractive woman who bends all her efforts to being attractive to men. And like recognizes like. And so men become rakes and women become docile beauties for men. And both, on both sides, this inhibits the future improvement of the human species, because a rake is a fragment of a human being, and a docile beauty is a fragment of a female human being, because women are more than just objects of attraction for men, right? So both suffer, both genders. So in light of that, let's read paragraph 8 and see if it makes more sense. Rakes know how to work on their sensibilities, on the sensibility of women thus shaped, whilst the modest merit of reasonable men has, of course, less effect on their feelings. So real men who have developed their reason and maybe are not quite so charming for women, they cannot reach the heart of these women by way of the understanding, because they have few sentiments in common. These men who have developed their reason, they're not looking for just a docile beauty. And the docile beauty is looking for a rake, because he satisfies her needs. He completes who she is. So the man of reason, the fully developed human being, has really nothing in common with the rake, and the rake has everything in common with the docile beauty. So now we move on to paragraph 9. She asks, why expect women to be, it seems a little absurd to expect women to be more reasonable than men in their likings and still to deny them the uncontrolled use of reason. There's another. What I've learned as I study philosophy, I look for certain, well, I mean, since I'm trying to extract the philosophical anthropology of these writings, I'm thinking about reason a lot and thinking, what is it that would fulfill then the human species? And I look for any locution that she uses. And here's another, the uncontrolled use of reason. So let's read that sentence again. It seems a little absurd to expect women to be more reasonable than men in their likings and still to deny them the uncontrolled use of reason. So the uncontrolled use of reason would be a fully developed human being. And then she asks a series of rhetorical questions, but they're really not, a rhetorical question is not a question. She's making statements in the form of questions. When do men fall in love with sense? When do they, with their superior powers and advantages, turn from the person to the mind, the personality to the mind? And how can they then expect women who are only taught to observe behavior, like etiquette and manners and the superficial charms of human nature? And how can they then expect women who are only taught to observe behavior and acquire manners rather than morals? That's an interesting distinction, right? Manners is just etiquette and behaving properly and appropriately. Morals is who you are and your convictions and your character. And she's saying that women have been allowed to acquire manners, but not morals. To despise what, let me read the whole paragraph. And how can they then expect women who are only taught to observe behavior and acquire manners rather than morals to despise what they have been all their lives learning to attain? I mean, why should women despise rakes when all their life they've been formed by these invisible forces to be the object of a rake's admiration? Okay, why should they then? Why complain that they're attracted to the rake, to the man who knows how to give compliments? Where are they suddenly to find judgment enough? Judgment, good judgment. That is so important in life, by the way. That's like more important than all the things you're going to learn in college. The ability to make judgments, not be judgmental, that's a different thing. Making judgments means to know what rings true and what's not true, what's empty and what's full, what's substantial and what's superficial, and to critically evaluate arguments, those kinds of things. That's what she means by judgment. So she asks this rhetorical question, then where are they suddenly, with this kind of shaping and lack of education, of genuine education, where are they suddenly to find judgment enough to weigh patently the sense of an awkward, virtuous man? Maybe there's some awkward, virtuous, truly virtuous, wise man, and she's going to pass by when his manners, of which they are made critical judges, are rebuffing, and they may not have all, they may be uncouth, but they're not rakes. So she's just saying that what she's going to be attracted to then is her counterpart, this rake. On paragraph 10, she starts making some interesting distinctions. She starts talking about love, and she's distinguishing romantic love from the ancient Greek notion of friendship. The ancient Greeks thought the romantic love was a wonderful thing, but there was something greater than romantic love. They didn't even have an idea of romantic love. That came in the Middle Ages with the troubadours and so on. But they had this idea of erotic desire. And she seems to be siding with the ancient Greek idea that there's something based on esteem of one another's character. In other words, what you love is who the person is in terms of their character. And so she has a whole critique here of what goes by the name of love. She has romantic love in mind. She goes on, love is in a great degree is an arbitrary passion. You ever notice how arbitrary things are? I remember when I was in India, and 90%, at least then, it's probably about the same now because things change very slowly in India. 90% or even more of the marriages are arranged marriages in India. And I asked some of the young, because it was so strange to me to, marry somebody my parents had picked out. So I would ask the young people, don't you want to choose the person you're marrying? Oh no, they would say, my parents know much better than me, So I ran it by my friend who's a philosopher, my mentor, and then he became my good friend. And he said, and most marriages end in divorce, in the West. And in fact, they would say that in India too. She said, well, you can't put your ideals of marriage above ours. All your marriages are divorce. Over 50% marriages are divorced. And if you go back to the younger, it's even higher than that, the young people. But what she's saying here is that it's quite arbitrary, from a certain standpoint, who people end up with. And so she points out love, and now she's not talking about true love. She's talking about what goes by the name of love in society. In a great degree is an arbitrary passion and will reign like some other stalking mischief by its own authority without deigning to reason. that, um, like what I was saying about the Indian people that I asked, they would say, no, my parents know much better than I do who I should marry. Uh, and by the way, most of those families that the older couples that I was with in India who were married with arranged marriages, they loved each other as much as anyone loves anyone in this country. But the choice about who they were going to marry was made by their parents, because the idea that the parents know better than they do. So that's Mary is, what she is saying here is that there's something arbitrary about it, and it has very little to do with reason. And then she says, and it may also be easily distinguished from esteem. And that means respect of one another's character, which is the foundation of friendship. For sure, she's read Aristotle, because I've read Aristotle. And in his Ethics, he talks about genuine friendship, philia, is based on esteem or mutual respect for one another's character, not on the pleasures that one another give one another. Actually, now that I think about it, she's really articulating that ancient Greek distinction between genuine friendship, which is much more solid and deeper than what goes by the name of romantic love or falling in love, and so on. She goes on, the foundation, it may also be easily distinguished from esteem, the foundation of friendship, because it's often excited by effervescent beauties and graces. And then in paragraph 11, common passions are excited by common qualities. So here's where she's going to talk about this like balance between the rake on one side and the docile beauty on the other. Men look for beauty and the simper of good-humored docility. So we had to look up the word simper. It means to smile with a silly and in an unaffected way. I picture this gentleman complimenting a woman, and then she smiles in a kind of silly way. Men look for beauty and the simper of good-humored docility. So that's what men look for. And here she's talking about perspective. What are men looking for in women? This. What are women looking for? The rake who can charm them. Women are captivated by easy manners. A gentlemanlike man seldom fails to please them, and their thirsty ears eagerly drink the insinuating nothings of politeness, whilst they turn from the unintelligible sounds of the charmer, reason, charm, he never so wisely. With respect to superficial accomplishments, the rake certainly has the advantage, and these females can form an opinion, for it is on their ground. So in other words, she says they generally are attracted to superficial adornments among men. Rendered gay and giddy by the whole tenor of their lives, the very aspect of wisdom, or the severe graces of virtue must have a lugubrious appearance to them. So the very things that cultivate human nature, namely what? Wisdom, virtue, in the sense of excellence of character, they must have a lugubrious appearance to them, and it must look sad and boring, and produce a kind of restraint from which they and love revolt. Without taste, accepting of the lighter kind, for taste is the offspring of judgment. So she's saying there that this education is prohibiting also good taste. That's important, because to be human, then for Mary, would be to be a woman or a man of good taste. But good taste is something that sees beyond the superficial. She says taste is the offspring of judgment, but it's precisely judgment that's being denied. How can they discover that true beauty and grace must arise from the play of the mind? So again, it's everything that's what she's talking about are all these invisible forces that are in society that are shaping human beings to bypass the very quality that makes humans be human, namely the development of reason and intelligence. Starting on paragraph 13, and I'm going to stop going, so close to the text right now, but she starts talking about the future now. So instead of just leveling a critique of the condition of human nature among the two sexes, she's offering also a pathway to the future. And this is what I've gotten from this reading is that her thinking is deep enough that it goes beyond the times that she wrote. So it did, it emerged from the times that she wrote, but at the same time, it's speaking beyond her times because it's reaching into principles that go beyond just any particular historical epoch. So if the feminist movement wants to deepen itself, then it would be a good thing to return to her writings. But from paragraph 13 to the end, she talks about the future of human nature and what it might be like if we could somehow take a deliberate, unmask these invisible forces that are shaping human nature and begin to move more deliberately. Supposing, however, for a moment, she writes in paragraph 13, that women were in some future revolution, she's thinking about the feminist movement, perhaps, of time, to become what I sincerely wish them to be, even love would acquire more serious dignity. All that talk that she had, that the docile beauty that women have strived to become, they would start, the very notion of love would be recast and made more substantial. It would develop a more serious dignity and be purified of its own fires. Purified of what? Of this silly relationship between the rake and the docile beauty that has become the very definition of romantic love. And virtue giving true delicacy to their affections, they would turn with disgust from the rake. Reasoning then, as well as feeling, the only province of women, that she's being sarcastic there. I mean, women are assumed to be just people who only have feelings and very little reasoning. The very province of women at present, they might easily guard against exterior graces and quickly learn to despise the sensibility that had been excited and hackneyed into the ways of women, and trade whose trade was vice and allurements, wanton airs. And then down at the bottom of page, on paragraph 15. Oh, let's move to paragraph 14 then. Paragraph 14 then, she's criticizing the very way that women then make choices in husbands. The grand truth, one grand truth women have yet to learn through much though much it imports them to act accordingly. In the choice of a husband, they should not be led astray by the qualities of a lover. For a lover, the husband, even supposing him to be wise in virtue, cannot remain long. In other words, if women base their whole decisions about who they're going to marry on how much they are wooed by a man, namely the rake, or the rake-like man. We don't use that word today, but the one who satisfies their feminine desire to be pleasing to men and attractive. She's going to say that that this, once he's married, he can't be a rake anymore. Don Giovanni, the seducer, once he's married, if he wants to remain, well, if he wants to have extramarital affairs, then he's not a very good husband. But if he doesn't, then he's not the rake anymore. He's not the seducer because he's already seduced. So now, who is he? And she's going to say, he doesn't know who he is anymore. Actually, I've met people like that in my life. They were like womanizers and Don Giovanni, like in the opera. And once they got married and they decided that it's too chaotic to have extramarital affairs. And so they stopped doing that. But then they didn't know who they were because that's their whole identity was based on being womanizers. So she's going to make that point. Were women, paragraph 15, more rationally educated, that's her whole thing, that women need to be educated properly. It's not just more education, but proper education. Were women more rationally educated, could they take a more comprehensive view of things, they would be contented to love but once in their life, and after marriage, calmly let passion subside into friendship. Again, friendship being higher than this passionate romantic love. I like the expression, a more comprehensive, they could take a more comprehensive view of things. See, let's stop there and give some thought to that. What does it mean to take a comprehensive look at things? It means to see the whole, Well, seeing the whole has to do with wisdom. And what does it mean to be human? It means to be a homo sapien. Well, the word sapien means wisdom. So the more wisdom we achieve, the more human we become. Well, the whole is the flower of wisdom. A more comprehensive view of things is a wise view of things. Wisdom is always connected with the whole. Speculative wisdom has to do with seeing the whole story of existence, divine and human. Practical wisdom has to do with seeing the whole situation and choosing the best course of action. And wisdom speaking, namely eloquence, has to do with speaking the whole truth about a topic. So wisdom is always connected with the whole. One great philosopher, Vico, said that the whole is the flower of wisdom. So when she says, were women more rationally educated, could they take a more comprehensive view of things? They would be contented to, but let's just stop there. They would be able to see a comprehensive view of things. They would become more human. And then she goes on to say they would marry just once and they would allow that passion to develop into something higher, namely friendship, philia, in the deep sense of friendship, the Greek notion of friendship. She ends with a warning. Let's jump to the 18th paragraph. Well, I mean, the 16th one, she makes a good statement. Half the sex is in present infantile state. She's talking about women being fixated in their infantile state because of these forces that are shaping them. Well, she's also warning women. She says, if you do marry this rake, the one who satisfies the man view of what a woman ought to be, then he's going to change into a suspicious tyrant who contemptuously insults the very weakness that he fostered. We're going to touch upon this when we take a look at Hegel. There's a passage from Hegel's philosophy where he talks about how when there's this master-slave relationship, then the master turns the slave into an object that he can use. Then he begins to despise the very thing that he objectified. And there's this turn. So what she's saying here is that when there is then a liaison between what she calls the rake, which is the counterpart to this docile beauty that women have become, when they finally get married, the rake becomes a suspicious tyrant. And he despises the very weakness that he's shaped the woman to be. Who contemptuously insults the very weakness he fostered. And he wanted its docile beauty. Now he has this docile beauty, and he thinks she's empty because she can't think for herself, and she's a docile, and she's a fragment of a human being. So he ridicules her. So she's untangling all of these inhibiting forces to the future development of the human species. When the habits of weak people are consolidated by time, a reformation is barely possible and actually makes the beings miserable. She's just talking about once it's reached this level where the rake comes together with the docile beauty, it's almost impossible for any kind of growth. She's talking about the obstacles to the future evolution of the human species. That's what these writings, these 18 paragraphs are all about. And she ends with a warning, the last paragraph. If such the force of habit, which she started talking about right in the beginning with these associations, if such is the bondage of folly, how careful ought we to guard the mind from storing up vicious associations? Okay. And equally careful should we be to cultivate the understanding. She's offering a solution now. To save the poor right from the weak dependent state of even harmless ignorance. For it is the right use of reason alone which makes us independent of everything, accepting the unclouding reason, the unclouded reason, whose service is perfect freedom. So she's ending in showing that if there's no cultivation of reason, then we have our loss of freedom. So that's just a little glimpse into a big work called A Vindication of the Rights of Women by Mary Wollenstoncraft, the mother of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. And those are some of the principles of philosophical anthropology that I've found in those 18 paragraphs. So I think that's enough for Mary Wollenstoncraft, and I'll see you again.